I don't know about maintainer tracks. I think those come later as well. So that's it. That's for Salt Lake City in November.
Okay, I can go next. So
Yep.
let me share my screen.
I can share it if you want, but feel free to as well.
Okay. So yeah, I recently found this bug in the request authentication API. We recently introduced the remote jog setting in which a user can directly use the Envoy mode, where like Envoy will fetch the jogs publicly instead of Istio. So the way, if it is an external server, user has to create the service entries, and if it is a HTTPS server that uses like default CS, trusted CS, then they have to create a destination rule as well. So it's something like this. So let's assume it's a jogs URI is a userserver.com, user create a service entry for userserver.com, and then a destination rule, which is like the more simple, and then SNI, something like this. Now the request authentication, it will work. Envoy will make a request. It will use a hostname user.com and everything will work for the request authentication. But when there's a use case where user is directly pushing the traffic from the application, the TLS traffic to the user server.com, it will fail because now we have created a destination rule that is adding one more layer of TLS on top of it. So I think the setup, and if we try to change the service entry to some different host name for just request authentication, in that case, when Envoy tries to make a call, it will update the authority header. Let's say if I use like dummy server.com in the host and I do the routing for the user server.com, then Envoy will update the authority header and will put the dummy server.com, and the upstream server, the external server, it will like basically deny the request. So I assume this is a bug in request authentication, and to fix this, we should probably go with the auto generation of the cluster entries for the request authentication when we use a remote jog setting. Any comments on this? Yeah,
or fix our code so we support this use case better. It seems like a generic problem that may have different host names. Exactly, fix the config. So you can put arbitrary names and then make sure that whatever name you put, like my service external, I mean, you basically use two different host names when you make the request, so they are not confused.
A lot of times they don't own these services, right? The external services where this jogs is hosted or all those things, so they cannot update it to use a different host name sometimes.
No. I mean, use a different name in our internal names, and then make sure that when you use foo.internal, the request goes to have all the properties necessary. I mean, the host name, SNI, and everything else set up properly. So that's a very common use case where you have a host name, external host name, and you want to access it in different ways, with simple, with mutual, with different other properties.
But
the solution for that is it's unique. I mean, you have a single destination rule. It's keyed by host. Is basically to create a layer of indirection early on. We have an internal name that is different for each use case, and at the end to override the host name, SNI, and everything else. I don't know if I explained clearly.
Okay. So one question, like I tried checking if we change the host name, we can change it via virtual service, but since Envoy is making a request directly here, so it's not going via path of LDS, RDS, EDS, and DDS. We are just giving Envoy a cluster entry, and it is taking it from there. So there is no way we can update the host name for this and these settings.
I see. So it doesn't go through. There is no way to set host name on the cluster on what we are using.
Yes.
I thought there is a way to set the original. Okay.
No, so you can do it. So the easiest way in theory would be that if the jogs URI could specify a subset, and then on that subset only, you could specify TLS. Right, that would be trivial. So the issue is that there's no way to specify subset in this API. But you can do the opposite. You can just say that the default subset or lack of subset is TLS, just like you have. Add a new subset. This syntax, by the way, is probably all wrong. I just wrote this up. Add a new subset. I called it direct and say no TLS, and then route all traffic from the user with the virtual service to that subset. Then it's fine, right? All the user traffic will match a virtual service, go to the direct subset, use no TLS. All the request auth will not, and it will go to.
I see.
this one.
Yeah, this makes sense. I can try this. But the long-term solution for this, what I was thinking, the way we are configuring this remote jog setting. So in the remote jogs, so in the Envoy remote jog setting, there's the HTTP URI and then the cluster name. So we can still use the dummy cluster name if user uses the dummy host name. But when we configure the HTTP URI, in that we use the real URI, like the real host name. How would that sound? That would resolve all the issues. Like the dummy cluster is there because we have a dummy service entry, dummy host name service entry, but the actual host name, while we building this configuration for the request authn, that will still use the real host name.
What is the real host name? Is that host name not user server example.com?
Yeah, it is. Okay.
So I probably don't understand what you're suggesting.
So what I'm suggesting, like so I have a service entry with a dummy host name that points to the real host name in the address. In the service entry, I have a host name, let's say dummyusercontent.com, and in the address I have the real host name. Now this service entry will create a cluster entry for the dummy host name, right?
No, I don't think that's the right way to use our APIs. That's mixing up front ends and back ends.
Well, I'm the first to complain about front ends and back ends, but it's not completely wrong, and it's similar to the target address you added to service entry, John. Maybe I misunderstand the proposal, and it looks better in my head than what you said.
No, I can explain it in a biased way that will make it look more to my idea, and then I'll try to explain it in a more neutral way. So this is what the proposal is that if you have a setting like this, we won't use userserver.com as the host header. We'll use 1234 as the host header. That doesn't make sense. That's not how you access services in, like when I call google.com, the host header is google.com. It's not 1234, whatever it's resolved to. Now it's a little more confusing because this is DNS. And so technically this is some DNS name, but it's still in Istio. This is just a source of endpoint. It's not even really, like this is not something you would ever do in curl or Google, Chrome or whatever.
But
like it's not the name, it's not what you're reaching. It's just how you get there. If that makes sense. It's like the next hop.
But John, if you take a step back, I mean, you are talking on port 80, and then you added a target port magic that somehow magically rewrites it to port 443.
Sure.
It's no different than that. Basically, we're rewriting the host header. I mean, we use an internal name, which is perfectly valid because you can control the DNS. You can set as many as you want. And then when I mean, I don't think address is the right way. Maybe we can extend service entry with some other field. But it keeps the distinction between front end and back end because the front end is a name up, the one that is in the service entry is the one that the client is using. And the back end is the one that you use as a destination. It's exactly how address is supposed to be used. I mean, it's as a destination. And when you talk with google.com or dns1.com, you are supposed to use dns1.com as SNI host header and everything else. That's normal HTTP.
So if I had this, which host header do I use? Because in Envoy, you can't say, I know what you're going to say is whichever one ends up being used. That's not an option in Envoy unless you go change how Envoy works.
Well, you can, basically that's a traffic split basically between DNS1 and DNS2. I mean, we generate two cluster DNS. I mean, it's not completely impossible. I don't think it's that important as use case.
It's not two clusters. It's one cluster, userserver.com with two endpoints.
No. But we so endpoint is probably the wrong. I mean, probably we should have a more clear backends or some other more specific, so we don't confuse it to normal endpoints. But we don't generate one cluster if we see something like that. And I'm not saying we need to support this. I mean, it's just a common use case. You have a single one.
Are you saying we should not generate one cluster, or we don't today?
I'm saying probably we don't need to support the case you have multiple endpoints when you specify a fully qualified domain name as endpoint. I mean, I don't think he needs both DNS1.com and DNS2.com. And if we do want to support DNS1.com and DNS2.com, we generate two clusters, one with DNS1.com and one to DNS2.com, and we do a traffic split between them.
But this is totally violating like how the API works both in Istio and how it maps to Envoy.
But
Like,
it's
okay, so
the benefit.
the thing that we're trying to do is point a JOX URI to userserver.com, right?
Yes.
Now, if we turn this into 2 clusters, Envoy cannot point to 2 clusters. It can only point to 1 cluster.
Okay.
So, like,
let's have a single cluster.
It doesn't work.
I don't know where you are extending the problem. I mean, he's not. Nobody asked for 2 clusters. I mean, why?
No, I'm extending the problem to show that the model that we were trying to pitch is not how the API model works. You can't just say like this is the destination, this is the service, this is the host header. That's how the model works both in Istio and Envoy. These are just endpoints. Like these should not be used as the host header. These should not be used as the cluster.
Replace with endpoints with target host. So put target host with a single and DNS1.com. So target host, DNS1.com. No, a single one, a single value. Okay. Would it look better?
Why not
you
just
have an internal name?
Why not just make one service entry that is the thing you want then?
Because the host is different. I mean, you the destination. I mean, the HTTP specific. Forget about Envoy and HTTP specification. If you have an external site, expect DNS1.com to have SNI host header and the certificates to match DNS1.com. There is no way around it. What we are doing in Istio, we're using the DNS autolocation, DNS interception to take over a DNS1.com IP, and then user is using DNS1.com. Hopefully, it's there. I mean, it's back to DNS. I mean, with this approach, userserver.com or .internal, you have control over DNS. You use internally with HTTP's userserver.com. But at the end, we do the right thing without extra complexity and tons of destination rules and other things, because maybe it can be destination URL like https dns1.com. So it's clearly that is specifically for HTTPS cases.
Yeah, this would resolve the problem. Like the way we configure request auth, and the JOX URI, we still said that's userserver.com. The cluster will be user server, but the host name we use at DNS1.com.
I don't think this belongs in service entry as an API. Maybe we add onto request auth a new host name field as an override.
No, but John, the point is that this is a far more generic problem than I mean, this is a very, very, very common use case where I mean, to not use, if we want to support external DNS use cases, which is what I'm trying to do, that's why I'm interested in this subject. Again, if we don't have DNS interception, how do you do it? You need a real internal DNS, split horizon DNS, or real DNS that you use for the external names that applications resolve, and you need somehow to map it to the real host name.
Right, and that's what a route is. That's not what a service entry is, right? Like you have a route that says match use server 1 and go to server 2. You shouldn't say that server 1 has endpoint server 2. That's like wonky.
I don't mind that either. I mean, having a route, requiring a route and I mean, for this particular use case, translating the combination of route and service entry.
So why the route doesn't work for this specific use case is because request auth doesn't go through routes. But it's the outside of request auth, that route is like a clear answer in my mind. So it's a request auth specific problem.
Can we make it go through route?
I don't know.
I see 2 ways. I mean,
Envoy, but maybe.
Well, no, but without changing Envoy. I mean, if we detect that the virtual service is matching, we can just
like logically, statically run the route in Istio effectively, and
not support arbitrary routes. I mean, again, it's at least elegant. Or proxy. I mean, can you use an egress gateway, or can we internally create route it to localhost something and send it to
I mean, you can put whatever you want here. That's
like we used to do with a sandwich or some version of the sandwich.
Yeah, I mean, you could absolutely put this to localhost. Like, there's a lot of ways to solve this problem today. I posted one. You could do route to localhost.
So one question on the solution you posted, John. So the virtual service, it will be applied to all the sidecars in the RDS with the sidecar as well, right?
Yeah.
The routing rules inside this. I see.
I mean, it depends on how you configure it. I just made a simple one. Obviously, you could have more advanced stuff.
Actually, that's not a bad idea because then you can do traffic splitting. You can use pretty much all the property, all the settings in Istio, in virtual service and whatever for the external OZ. So basically, you have absolute full control. If you want to have a canary for the external OZ or you do whatever, everything that is available in Istio API becomes available in this.
Okay, I'll try this virtual service first.
And one more thing, if you happen to use an egress gateway, then you have some other benefits if you have firewall rules or whatever policies that don't allow envoys to directly go outside. You can have the egress gateway make the request, and may do some caching. Maybe may have something smarter locally that is doing.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's all from my side on this.
All right, we've got another one from Mike. Expose request budget. Interested in Mike, you're here, right? You want to go over this?
You hear me?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, so this is something that I had asked about a few months back. I linked to the notes in the prior discussion. And what I'm trying to do now is get into like what are the actual implementation details for this. On the November 15th meeting when we brought this up, it was the determination was we could do this and we just need to figure out kind of the semantics and what it would look like. And then there was a note about like this is potentially awkward because of where retry budgets are implemented in Envoy currently as the like circuit breaker on backend cluster. So what I'm trying to figure out now is would changes be needed to Envoy to implement this, or is this something that we would want to work around just in Istio itself?
I think it's a bit ambiguous to me right now without more context, which may be written down already. What does it mean if I have two different routes with two different retry budgets pointing to the same service? Like that's the problem that we need to answer in order to figure out the answer to your question.
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question.
Because for some context on why this is a good question, I think, is the way that you could do a per route policy that impacts a cluster in Envoy is for every route you clone the cluster, basically. But that actually has some impacts because things that are cluster-wide, like what % of requests failed, are now not shared, right? They're split. And it also sucks from an implementation standpoint because now we have to make a bunch of clusters for a bunch of routes potentially. But that's like at least an internal detail. Like the issue of unsharing is actually, that actually impacts things. And it's not just retries that it impacts outlier detection, which is totally separate from the config. It impacts a bit extreme, but like round robin technically. Now it's not round robining. It has two round robins happening at once, right?
That makes sense.
So I don't we've avoided this in these two APIs, which is very handy. I don't know that we can necessarily avoid it entirely in Gateway API. There are a lot of Envoy implementations, and they would all have this issue. We do have one API that inverts this, but it's in the opposite direction. It's a destination rule setting that impacts routes, which is the...
And that's what I've seen, like, a few different attempts to add this in the past or requests for this to be added seem to be asking for it on destination rule. And I'm hoping to be able to implement it on upstream and Gateway API on HTTP route.
Yeah. So it is also a possibility that maybe Envoy can go add this at the route level. Like it is something that logically makes sense at both layers, I think. Like you can say that here's my budget for this route, and here's my budget for this
for.
So,
okay. Yeah, because if there's a good case for doing this in Envoy, like that's totally a path that we would be willing to take.
In my mind, the correct behavior, if you put something on a route, is to only impact that route and not have all these random other implications. which would imply that Envoy would have to do it at the route level. So I'm kind of thinking that whatever Envoy and the Gateway API does needs to be aligned.
That makes sense.
And it's probably better to do it in Envoy because I think from a user standpoint, it makes more sense to do it at the route, especially given, is retry already there or is there no retry at all?
I think the like max number of retries is already there.
Okay, so we're just the budget. Yeah, then
Yeah,
it would
I
be really
double
weird to
check on
have
that.
retries in route and then retry budget in some other policy, probably. That would be a bit awkward, I think.
Yeah.
I think I've been talking a lot and others seem to have a, go ahead, Cosmin or whoever.
I'm trying to understand what's the context a bit better here. Do we need this in upstream gateway, and it's something that we expect all implementations will support, or is it one of those options that only Envoy supports it, but we push it upstream anyway, or what's the relation with the gateway API?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. Happy to give context on that. So, upstream and gateway API, there is a general desire to add retry to HTTP route. Prior proposals have just focused on like the simplistic count retries of like you can retry up to 3 times. I've also seen separately several users asking in prior attempts at adding budgeted retries to Istio specifically. One of the complexities with adding retries in Gateway API is that Linkerd only supports budgeted retries. So in order to basically get a like globally useful extended ability to do retries, I'm basically looking at 2 different facets of it. You can implement either simple count-based retries or budgeted retries and have that
But,
scoped
to
under
step-
like a feature.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. I understand why the user wants it, but in Istio, the user have a way to do it, no, today. So for an Istio user using the gateway API with the policy attachments that we have, we don't have a problem. Users can express it.
Currently or
Yes, currently, right now, if you use the whatever attachments that we added for gateway API to target ref and attaching Google Istio policies as gateway API policies.
okay, yeah. So yeah, the desire is to simplify the UX here by having it on HTTP root itself. It's not necessarily unlocking new functionality for Istio, but it should simplify the UX and make it more standard.
But it's not simplifying for Istio users because Istio users already use it and so basically we are just adding an extra way to do it and actually adding complexity for Istio users. So I mean we have a very powerful
exactly because
there's no retry budget
rule
already.
No,
we can add
no
it in destination rule. No, but we can add it in destination rule. I mean we can have our destination.
Yeah, we could, but I think it's actually a bit awkward from a user standpoint to configure retries at the route level and then retry budget at the destination rule level. At least I think so, personally. Like those to me as a user seem like you would configure them in one place.
My underlying question is basically the reason I'm concerned is that in the gateway API we are trying to fit some particular concepts that we believe are right or wrong, and it's not clear if all implementations have that support. So instead of looking at what Envoy is doing and Nginx is doing and all the other vendors are doing and seeing what is common, we are saying, oh, we want to put in HTTP route and then let's change Envoy and Nginx and whatever else and have an optional API that nobody will support and all that. I don't think it's going to be very pleasant for the users.
I'll defer to Keith for a second before I continue. See a hand raised.
Yeah, I think, Mike, you mentioned Linkerd being one of the properties that only supports route level retry budget. Have they considered a service level retry budget, or do we have an idea? To Costin's point, do we have an idea of what the level of abstraction is for retry budgets and other proxy implementations?
Part of the work of this is looking at that. What I've seen so far is retry budgets, like as you can see from some of the comments on the Istio issues asking for this, is that It is functionality that is desirable and has properties that help make it more resilient than your typical max count retries.
So in practical terms, can we have, let's forget about the K2 API upstream. What would be the right place to add this feature in Istio? In virtual service, where would we put it in Istio for getting K2 API?
So
my
it sounds like
mind-
the easiest place is destination role if you're just directly exposing the existing Envoy functionality. And I'll defer to John on whether that's the right place or not.
I would say the right place with what we have in Envoy today is destination role. The right place, if we change Envoy, is virtual service.
But I mean, first of all, I mean, if we believe that destination rule is more or less mapped to clusters, and Envoy is represented in cluster.
Yeah.
And again, if it's their decision, their design, and it's not completely invalid to have this in clusters.
No, I think it's valid to have it at both levels, right? Like, I'm not saying Envoy should go move it. Like, I'm saying they could add another option.
But it's perfectly valid to have it for people to just set it in cluster, to have settings in cluster, because it's simpler, whatever. I'm not saying a different implementation may not choose to put it in routes. I'm not saying a different implementation may not choose to put it in both routes and clusters. But if we agree there is a cluster option, it's reasonable to have in destination rule. And that's not the problem for each user.
Yes, I agree that given that it's in cluster, destination rule is the right place. I think that there's a valid argument to be made that Envoy should also add it at the route level, in which case I would prefer virtual service. But
and then we can have it in both. I mean, if Envoy provides an option for user to configure either by route and by cluster, we'll provide an option for users to set it in destination rule if they want it by cluster, or in route if they want the flexibility to have it per route. I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, even if Envoy have it per route, we should not have it per cluster as blocks their feature or not support it. So Envoy changes take time, and we need to convince them. Let's do the simple thing, and not simple, so tight thing. I mean, they have a feature retry budget on clusters. Let's do it.
So one data point to add here is I just checked the link of your documentation, and it looks like they have a similar layout to Envoy, where you configure a route to be retried, that a route is retryable, but the okay, John just responded to it, so let me read that real quick.
I'm not confident. That was just my interpretation of reading the same doc you did, was that isn't saying to retry it. It's saying that it could be retried if you later have it config that says retry it. Because some requests you can't retry, right? But yeah. I do think if the GEP doesn't already have like a big list of all this info, then it should be added.
But just taking a step back, for Istio perspective, is there any objection to add it in destination rule? And if later Envoy adds it to routes, we can add it there as well? Because the semantics is different. I mean,
what if user config both when you add it also to the virtual service?
We match whatever Envoy is doing. I mean, if Envoy when Envoy defines per route, they will define what is the behavior, and it will be crazy for us to do something different, to try to do different than what Envoy does.
I mean,
because we won't be able to.
Would the retry budget be executed twice?
I have no idea. I mean, Envoy will decide when. That's the problem with asking Envoy to implement it per route, because they will need to make those kind of choices. It's not an easy thing because they already have it in clusters. They cannot remove it. So they will need to make some choices, and we probably cannot make different choices than they do. So we probably, when the implementation happens, we'll need to provide feedback and all that. But what is clear that if the user set it per destination rule, which is equivalent with service, we have a clear path, and it's very clear, very simple. There is no problem. We can ship it in next release.
But there's no I don't think a goal is to go ship budgeted retries as fast as possible.
No. But it's a clean implementation.
In general, I have seen a desire for an Istio.
This is like in the next 2 years, we want to ship we want to have something that's good.
Sure. But does anyone disagree that it's reasonable for people? I mean, we have the same discussion with persistent stations. I mean, to put it in per route or put it per cluster. Both are valid, and we agreed to support both cases. I mean, some people want to attach policy to service, some people want to attach it to route. That's fine.
Can I ask a simple question? Do we have people lined up willing to do the work? Because I thought the discussion started as Mike is thinking about some of the upcoming change in the gateway API. Now we are evolving into implement this in the destination rule in Istio.
I would
We
be
need to implement it
interested
anyway,
in-
no?
I would be interested in doing the implementation work for a gateway API implementation of budgeted retries in Istio.
Which wouldn't be in destination rule, right?
If the upstream
I think it would be
if the upstream happen, if the upstream defines it per as a route policy, which basically that will mean that and we will need to implement it, everyone will need to implement it because they are stubborn and they want to put it in route for some whatever reason. If instead we put it in implement it in destination rule, it will be super easy to implement, and it doesn't need to change. And it will be still usable with the gateway APIs that we provide. I mean, not. So instead of making the world fit into our square whatever box, we should use a round box.
So I think we're coming at this from like two different perspectives. Like my motivation here is getting retries into Gateway API. And doing that in a standardized way if possible. And I am willing to do the work to like propose a new feature in Envoy if that's needed. And I'm also like okay if this takes longer to be available in Istio because we're taking a path that takes 3 steps instead of 1. Like I'm okay with that because that's aligned with kind of my motivation for this feature.
So basically you're saying because you absolutely have to have it in HTTP route, you are going to put it upstream in Envoy, in Gateway, force every other implementation to change their code to fit your API.
It's not forcing anybody to change anything. It's going to be an extended feature. It does have to be implemented by anybody. I'm hoping could be implemented by 3 implementations to be able to help graduate this retries in Gateway API to standard eventually. It not necessarily have to be an HTTP route. That's where I'm hoping it would be the most reasonable place to fit it. And part of the like early work on this is basically going to be what John had recommended just a minute ago of like doing like a step to document where is this implemented in existing proxies. Would this map seamlessly to them? Would changes be needed to them, etc. So figuring that out, like what's the pragmatic like lift here is going to be part of the initial like research on this.
Yeah, I think, Mike, what you are doing is not a direct objection from what I heard. However, to implement something in destination rule before this become a standard in the Gateway API, I'm not sure if there's drive and people willing to do the work for that.
Yeah.
If there is a user request and someone, I mean, it will be super easy. I mean, it's not a lot of work to add this to destination. We have other things. It's super easy. I mean, it's one of the easiest tasks probably. If there is no user who needs it, then of course nobody will do it, and probably we don't have to worry about the gateway because there is no user demand. But if there is real user demand,
I mean, there's like 3 PRs that have been closed and 1 issue that's still open of like many users asking for this functionality. I'm just not particularly motivated to implement it directly in destination role. If somebody else is, I would be happy for that to happen too.
I can take a look. I mean, if necessary. I mean, I haven't seen. Okay, let me rephrase it. If there is user demand, are we willing to accept a PR to change destination rule to add it there? John, are you opposed to that? I mean, because Envoy is not going to deprecate it. It's a stable feature.
I would personally rather just wait until it's added upstream because there's not that much demand for this in Istio. And that's kind of been our position, right? Is that if new features, unless there's super compelling reasons why we need them in Istio's API, just let them go upstream and then we don't have to deal with making a new API, bike shedding it, supporting it, then migrating to the gateway API once they add it, all these different things.
So basically, we're bike shed. We're letting gateway API, bike shed, create APIs that don't make sense for Istio, require major changes in Envoy or whatever, and will never be supported by more than 3 implementation, because Google gateways probably, they're usually based on backend and match very well with the
if gateway API adds a feature that's reasonable, then we'll probably add it, right? So we should either stop them from adding features we don't like.
Unfortunately, there is no way to do it, because they are saying that, oh, it's experimental, no problem, we find 3 implementation, all good, and then users suffer and we suffer because we need to take their crap. I mean, it's like the old days in Istio where anyone drew an API
this is not they. This is not some like abstract group of people in Gateway API. Like, this is me. If you think this is
I didn't want to say you.
I
didn't want to say you. Sorry, Mike. I didn't want to say you particularly, because it's not only you. I mean, other people are doing the same thing in Gateway. I mean, I'm very frustrated with the Gateway API model today, because it's
specific feature. This is me. Like, I am in a position to drive this team. Part of the research that I want to do is exactly what you're talking about, of like examining existing implementation. It sounds like things to talk about. There's potentially 2 different places where this can be considered, teasing out the nuance for what that looks like in Nginx, in HA, in Envoy, in Linkerd, and coming up with like, are there, like, should it be implemented in one place? Should it be implemented in both? Like, what part of that makes it into Gateway API upstream? And like that's research that I'll be doing.
Okay, I mean, I'm 100% for it. If you find out in your research that mainstream servers and major servers, Nginx, HTTP, and so forth, support it in a particular way, and you just standardize how people are doing it already, then I'm all for it. I'm not against standardizing it. I'm against creating standards out of thin air that are not basically based on anyone actually supporting it and having actual practice, and then expecting everyone to change to implement your made-up standard. It's one thing to have existing behavior that is commonly used and say, okay, let's do something standard because everyone is doing the same thing in slightly different way. Another thing is, oh, I want to create a new API and let's make it optional and then force everyone. Effectively, because all optional APIs will have to implement it by everyone, because nobody wants to be the one that doesn't implement the features that users request. Vendor.
I mean, this is specifically, I intend for it to stay probably extended forever, because there's divergent ways. Some implementations have no interest in doing like your traditional like counted retries. So it's not expected for any one implementation to support both methods. And if we don't think this is going to make sense for Envoy-based implementations to support the budgeted retries one, then like maybe that's a dead end and that's okay. And we only move forward with like this count of like up to 3 attempts. And fine, like that is a path forward for this.
I think, Austin, overall, we'd like to find some path forward, right? If the Gateway API needs to wait for some projects to implement the feature and to show that it's useful before standardizing it across all projects, then it needs to be implemented in sub-projects. And those sub-projects will eventually have to adapt their API to whatever the Gateway API brings up. I think we heard this morning that that's not of interest to Istio because of the API problem, that we should wait for the Gateway API to standardize the API before we go to define our own, so that we don't have to migrate users from the Istio way of doing things to the Gateway API way of doing things. So one way or the other, we've got to start somewhere. Somebody's got to write the first API, whether it's the Gateway API group or Istio or someone else.
No, someone needs to write the implementation, and we already have an implementation. We are basically this close to having this shipped in destination rule, because cluster is there. We don't have to change Envoy. It's super trivial to ship it this way. We can gather feedback, how many people are actually using it after we add it there. And because again, we have some anecdotal evidence that some people need it, but they're not pushing that hard. I mean, the fact that we're willing to wait a year for Envoy to implement it suggests it's not that high priority or high popular. So maybe it should not even be an upstream API if it's so unpopular and just, we don't have evidence that it's going to be used. I mean, after we get data that 50% of Istio users use these fields, then will be a very strong argument that needs to be an upstream API and not just some implementation specific extension. I don't know. That's my opinion, because it's backwards basically from how normal standards work. It's not you define the API and then other implement it. It's you find out what it's used commonly and what users are doing, and define a standard that is all standards I've seen work that way. So if I send a PR to add it to destination rule, will be voted down?
John, I think you were the one sort of advocating for not implementing this in Istio first. Is that right?
Yes.
And your understanding is that it does belong in the upstream standard because it is something a lot of users want, or?
I don't know the user demand, but
Okay.
if there is, I mean, there's enough demand for it to be upstream, then great. They should put it upstream, and we should make sure it's done in a reasonable way, and or do it in a reasonable way because Mike's here and he's the one doing it. And then if it's done reasonably and in the API, then it seems reasonable to implement it. What I don't want is us to say like, okay, Gateway's adding it. I don't like how they're doing it. Let's go add in our API. We don't even necessarily have a strong demand for it. Like,
So if we don't have a strong demand, why would we put this pain on everyone implementing the Gateway API? I mean, if it was strong demand, I would understand. But if it's not strong demand, it's not kind of, we're turning Gateway API into Istio, basically, where we put absolutely every feature anyone ever dreamed of without any evidence that it's a common request. Anyway, I'm stepping out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, there is demand from other implementations for budgeted retries, and I want that to be one of the ways to configure retries in Gateway API. So even if Istio is a like lagging implementation or chooses not to, because there's not sufficient demand, I think that's okay. I guess like for me, next steps is I'm going to look closer at what it might take to propose adding it on the route in Envoy and see like what that implementation might look like. Or then also do kind of like what folks are talking about, basically survey existing implementations and look for what other proxies might implement something like this, and if so, where. So yeah, the context and what has been really helpful. So appreciate all the feedback here. Thanks all.
Looks like that was all that was on the agenda today. Is there anything else we want to chat about before the ambient meeting? In that case, it sounds like we can all enjoy a rare break between meetings. Enjoy.
thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks. See you.